The first kingship was in Eridu. That is how the Sumerian king list opens, not with Uruk, not with Babylon, not with Nineveh, but with Eridu, the marsh-edge city of the god Enki, whom Akkadian texts call Er. Before the flood, before the dynasties we can place against firmer chronology, before almost everything that later became Mesopotamian state memory, the tradition says kingship descended from heaven and came there first. I kept returning to that line because it forces a difficult starting point. If Eridu was remembered as the first city of rule, and if Eridu was Enki's city, then Enki does not begin at the edge of Mesopotamian religion. He begins near the centre of it. Mainstream scholarship has never treated Enki as obscure. Chal, the electronic text. Corpus of Sumerian literature preserves major Sumerian compositions in which he acts as world organizer, creator, trickster, and patron of order. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative catalogues the tablets and fragments on which those reconstructions depend. Orox's Ancient Mesopotamian Gods and Goddesses project, run through the University of Pennsylvania Museum Consortium, places Enki alongside Anu and Enlil among the highest gods of the pantheon. His cult centre was Eridu. His temple was the Iabzu, the House of the Abzu, named for the subterranean sweet waters beneath the earth. John George Taylor visited the site in 1854 and published his report in 1855. Reginald Campbell Thompson surveyed it in 1918. Harry R. H. Hall followed in 1919. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd excavated it between 1946 and 1949 under the Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities, uncovering the ziggurat and the Long Temple sequence beneath it. UNESCO now treats Eridu Tel Abu Shahrain as one of the foundational urban centres of southern Mesopotamia, and notes that most excavated remains were later reburied for protection, leaving the ziggurat dominant in the landscape. The British Museum holds some of the clearest iconographic evidence for Enki's identification. The Morgan Library used one of those objects, the Adda Seal, in its 2022-2023 exhibition on Mesopotamian women and writing because its divine figures are so secure and so canonical. Benjamin Foster, W.G. Lambert, Thorkild Jacobson, Jeremy Black, and a long line of philologists have all worked inside this terrain. This is textbook material. This is museum label material. This is cuneiform sign list material. None of it is fringe, none of it requires rescue from fantasy. The difficulty is not absence of data, it is what we choose not to do with it. What we choose not to do, in my view, is ask why one of Mesopotamia's oldest and highest gods keeps appearing in moments where divine decisions are made above him, and then quietly broken by him. In the Sumerian flood composition usually called the Eridu Genesis, the surviving lines are damaged, but not damaged enough to hide the structure. The gods take an oath. A decision is made that the seed of mankind is to be destroyed. The verdict, the text says, cannot be revoked. The order announced by An and Enlil cannot be overturned. And yet Ziusudra hears the warning anyway, not from a public reversal, but through a wall-side communication associated with Enki. In the later Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the structure is even clearer. Ea speaks not to the assembly, but around it. Wall, listen constantly to me. Read Hut. Make sure you attend to all my words. Dismantle the house, build a boat. Later, when survival is discovered, he says to the great gods, I did it. In defiance of you, I made sure life was preserved. I want to stay with that for a moment. I did it. In defiance of you. Not misunderstanding, not compromise, not mediation. Defiance. The mainstream explanation is that these myths dramatize tension inside the pantheon. Enlil as sovereign force, Enki as cunning wisdom, the assembly as collective authority, the flood as a literary mechanism for explaining mortality and social limits. All of that is valid. I am not dismissing it. But it does not close the question, because once you recognize that this is not a one-off act of kindness but a repeated structural role, Enki as the god who repeatedly finds a way around decrees that would diminish or destroy human life, you are no longer dealing with a charming side character. You are dealing with a theological problem, and it is not only the flood. In myth after myth, Enki solves crises through indirection, loophole or technical speech. He is the god of incantation, of craft, of civilization, of hidden mechanism. That is precisely why the defiance matters. If a storm god breaks things, that is easy to classify. If a wisdom god quietly preserves the condemned, The whole architecture feels less stable than the official hierarchy suggests. I want to be honest about where I'm landing. The anomaly is not that Enki behaves strangely. The anomaly is that the sources preserve this behaviour so clearly, and later scholarship so often treats it as colour rather than structure. What do you do with a god who is both foundational and disobedient? What does a civilization do with a benefactor who obeys cosmic hierarchy in public and breaks it in private? The first piece of evidence is textual and embarrassingly explicit. In Atrahasis, composed in the Old Babylonian period and copied for centuries afterward, humanity exists because the lesser gods revolt against labour, and Enki proposes a substitute species. Humans are made to bear the work. Later, when population noise irritates Enlil, annihilation measures follow in sequence: plague, famine, drought, then flood, at which time Enki interferes. He does not overturn the decree openly, and he circumvents it. He instructs Atrahasis through the wall of a reed house, preserving technical obedience while violating the decision in substance. Then, after the flood, he says the quiet part aloud: "I did it in defiance of you." If that sentence belonged to a minor demon, scholars would center it. Because it belongs to Ea, it is often absorbed into summary. Why? The second piece is older and harder to evade, because it sits at the very beginning of Mesopotamian historical imagination. The Sumerian king list says, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it places the flood as the great divider. Then the flood swept over. Eridu is not just any city in that memory. It is the first seat of rule before destruction, and Eridu is Enki's city. And as I discussed before in another piece on antediluvian kingship, origins matter because later scribes protect what they need at the beginning of a list. They do not place things there casually. So why is the city of the flood's covert opponent also the city where kingship begins? Before moving forward, this deserves attention. The third piece is the object I cannot quite get out of my head. In the British Museum, room 56, display case 11, sits BM 89115, the Adda Seal, a greenstone cylinder only 3.90 centimeters high and 2.55 centimeters in diameter. It is tiny. That is part of what makes it unsettling. You expect an object carrying this much theology to be monumental, but it fits inside a hand. Rolled out in impression, it shows a mountain band running beneath the gods. Ishtar stands armed and frontal. Shamash rises between peaked mountains with a serrated blade, and there, to the right, is Ea. He stands with 1 foot on the mountain. A Kishon bull lies between his legs. Streams pour from his shoulders. Fish swim in those streams. Behind him stands his attendant Usimu, two-faced, double-bearded, raising one hand. Ea reaches toward the zoo bird, the thief of destinies. The scene is crowded, balanced, canonical, but Ea is the figure I return to because he does not look like a remote sky sovereign. He looks like a force coming out of the deep, carrying life with him, as if fresh water itself has taken a human shape. The seal is slightly concave. There is a 2-line inscription naming Adda, the scribe who owned it. Below the framed inscription, a lion paces rightward and roars. The multiple horned crowns are still legible. The skirts, the curls, rays, scales of the mountain, all will remain compressed into that narrow green cylinder, as if the whole logic of divine order had been rolled tightly and made portable. That detail matters to me. Someone carried this. Someone sealed documents with it. Someone impressed this image of Ea, water-bearing, destiny-adjacent, life-bearing Ea, into clay, often enough for the object to become worn by use. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. What was this for? The fourth piece is a line from Enki and the World Order, preserved in Sumerian literary tradition. Enki says, "I am the seal keeper of heaven and earth." He oversees justice with An. He decrees good destinies with Enlil. Then the composition turns into a litany of assignment: waterways, storms, fields, brickmaking, weaving, herding, sea. Yes, he is not merely the patron of clever escapes. He is one of the architects of distributed reality. This is what makes the flood defiance harder, not easier to explain. The god who breaks the order is also one of the beings who established it. I want to sit with that before moving on. The fifth piece is later, and this is where the texture changes. By the second millennium, texts and rituals increasingly pair Ea with Marduk. Aurak summarizes the relationship with unusual bluntness. Ea provides the cell, Marduk oversees its implementation. Then the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, exalts Marduk above the great gods. Your command cannot be rebelled against. Let his command be superior. Marduk is born in the Apsu in Ea's own watery domain, as Ea's son, and then absorbs the kind of supremacy that earlier tradition distributed across older powers. Not erased, then, something subtler, a transfer, a theological inheritance in which the father remains venerable while the son receives operative kingship. Why does the benefactor become the source but not the throne? Once I noticed that pattern, I stopped thinking this was only about Mesopotamia. Across very different cultures, I kept finding the same structure. A divine or semi-divine figure acquires something restricted, life, light, fire, skill, the means of survival, against the wishes of a higher holder, then gives it to human beings, and is remembered thereafter not as the stable ruler of heaven, but as the trickster, the transgressor, the compromised benefactor. These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? I do not ask that lightly. I mean the structure, not the mood, a protected resource, a boundary, a breach. Humanity benefits. The giver does not become king. In Maori tradition, Maui does not politely receive fire on behalf of humanity. He tricks his ancestress Mahuika. According to the old Encyclopedia of New Zealand account preserved by Te Ara, he slips out at night and extinguishes all the cooking fires. Then he volunteers to seek new fire, and Mahuika draws flame from her fingernails one by one. Maui keeps putting each gift out and asking again until she realizes the deception and hurls the last nail down, setting the world ablaze. Fire survives for humans because sparks are thrown into specific woods, including kaikomaka, whose wood is then used to make flame. Same structure. An element under divine control becomes human property through deceit, not permission. And Maui, despite helping humanity, is not enthroned above all. He remains the dangerous culture hero who eventually dies in a failed assault on undeath. Why that distribution of memory? Among Northwest Coast traditions, the Raven stories preserve the same logic with different furniture. In one widely circulated telling shared by Haida and other coastal nations, the world is dark because an old man hoards all light inside nested boxes. Raven hears of it, transforms into a hemlock needle, enters the daughter's water bucket, is swallowed, is reborn as a child, and cries until the boxes are opened for him. Then he seizes the ball of light in his beak and escapes through the smoke hole. The fragments become moon and stars, the remaining light becomes the sun. Again, the pattern is exact. A guarded cosmological resource is hoarded. A cunning being penetrates the enclosure. The world changes because a rule is broken. Raven is essential. Raven is not king. Why do these traditions preserve gratitude and suspicion in the same figure? Mesoamerica gave me a third example that I find difficult to dismiss. In Nahua tradition preserved in the Codex Chimalpopoca, Quetzalcoatl descends to Mictlan to retrieve the bones of previous generations after the Lord of the Underworld resists him. He's obstructed, tricked, chased. A quail startles him. The bones fall and break. He still carries them out. Humanity in the next age exists because a divine figure crossed a boundary the Underworld did not intend to yield. And in another associated cycle, Quetzalcoatl obtains maize for humans after the food is hidden away, discovering it where other gods could not. Here again, the benefactor is linked to knowledge, mediation, and forbidden transfer, not final sovereignty. Not the throne, the breach. And what matters to me is that these examples are not sitting in a neat line of influence. Maori fire traditions, Northwest Coast Raven narratives, and Nahua accounts from central Mexico do not belong to some simple route of literary borrowing from southern Mesopotamia. They are separated by oceans, by language families, by ritual worlds that developed on their own terms. Yet the grammar keeps returning. A guarded necessity, a superior holder, a clever intermediary, a broken restriction, a human gain purchased through disobedience. And that does not prove a hidden origin. It does make indifference feel intellectually lazy. Before moving forward, I want to say this clearly. I am aware that independent cultures can generate similar stories because humans everywhere face the same problems. Cold, darkness, hunger, mortality. Comparative mythology can become lazy very quickly. But structural repetitions, this precise deserve more than a shrug. In each case, what humans need most is monopolized first. In each case, acquisition comes through cunning or transgression rather than lawful grant. In each case, the giver remains morally unstable in cultural memory. He is useful, necessary even, but not fully safe. That is not generic symbolism. That is a recurring template. Which brings me back to why this has not been pursued more seriously in the Mesopotamian case. There are legitimate reasons. Iraq's archaeological record has been shaped by war, sanctions, looting, and the stop-start rhythms of foreign and state-funded excavation. The Iran-Iraq War, the 1991 Gulf War, the sanctions decade, the 2003 invasion, and the violence that followed all damaged infrastructure for fieldwork. Mudbrick sites like Eridu are fragile. Conservation is expensive, funding bodies prefer projects with clearer publication pipelines and lower political risk. None of that is false, but it is not enough. Eridu's last major excavation campaign before the recent Italian-Iraqi return ended in 1949. The final report on Safar and Lloyd's work was not published until 1981. 32 years, a scholarly generation. And Marco Ramazzotti's 2015 review of the site stated that for more than 50 years Eridu had not been systematically investigated or excavated, and noted that before the new mission, the site's last official visit had been a 2-hour inspection on June 5, 2008. 2 hours. For the city the king list places first, for the cult centre of a god Aurak still calls one of Mesopotamia's 3 most powerful deities, for a site whose temple sequence reaches back into the Ubaid period and whose remains were largely reburied after excavation. 2 hours becomes a devastating measure of our priorities. I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that and in some ways more troubling. It is the ordinary failure produced when disciplinary habits harden. Assyriology studies the texts. Archaeology studies the level. Religious history studies the pantheon. Biblical studies isolates the flood parallels. Museum displays isolate iconography. Everyone does competent work inside a box. Very few ask what kind of god Enki actually is when these boxes are put back together. A creator of humanity, a keeper of destinies, a patron of civilization, a covert opponent of extermination decrees, a god whose first city sits at the beginning of kingship and then spends decades at the edge of systematic attention. Even the site's visibility works against the question. UNESCO notes that Eridu's excavated remains were mostly reburied except for the ziggurat, a sensible conservation choice that also makes the deeper sequence easier to forget. The 2014 permit signed for the Iraqi-Italian mission was treated rightly as a turning point, but the fact that it felt like a restart tells its own story. We had already known what Eridu was. We had already known whose city it had been. We had already known that the flood traditions placed one of history's most consequential acts of divine disobedience in the orbit of that god. And still, the subject remained strangely underasked, which I have covered in a previous piece on how institutional categories can hide a pattern in plain sight. I am not saying there was a secret committee that removed Enki from the record. I am not claiming every later elevation of Marduk was a cynical act of political theft. I am not saying the Mesopotamians themselves secretly worshipped a rebel god behind the backs of their official cults. But what I am saying is that the documented record repeatedly presents Enki or Ea as a high creator and protector of humanity who circumvents collective divine decisions, while later, canonical theology leaves him honoured but operationally displaced. That is not speculation. It is a plain reading of sources already considered standard. And once that is admitted, the quiet questions begin to multiply. Why does the earliest city of kingship belong to the god who later preserves humans against a divine death sentence? What did scribes think they were preserving when they retained Ea's own admission, "I did it, in defiance of you," instead of softening it into mediation? The record does not tell us why the benefactor of humanity is so often framed as a trickster rather than a sovereign, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. How many of Eridu's unanswered questions were sealed under reburied mud brick while scholarship moved on to better funded narratives? Why does BM 89115 place EA reaching toward the zoo bird, thief of destinies, while fish and fresh water pour from his body in the same image? Who inherits a god's authority and who inherits his memory? What exactly was transferred when Marduk took command and Ea kept the spell? We know the pattern, but not why it kept returning. A small greenstone cylinder sits under museum glass in London. It does not look like the centre of a historical problem. It looks almost delicate, something a scribe could close in his fist. But the more time I spend with it, the stranger it becomes. EA stands there forever with one foot on the mountain, water opening from his shoulders in two carved streams, fish suspended in that impossible current, the bull pressed beneath him, the double-faced attendant behind him, and the bird of stolen destinies in front of him. The seal is almost 4,300 years old. It was probably found at Sippar. It bears the name of Adda, a scribe. It is on display, labelled, catalogued, stabilised, interpreted. And still it feels unfinished, as though the object itself knows more than the paragraph beside it is willing to say. I think about Eridu then, the first city in the list, the temple buried beneath rebuilt temples, the ziggurat above older sanctuaries, the long publication delays, the decades of near silence, the 2-hour visit, the reburied walls. I think about Zusudra at the wall, Atrahasis in the reed house, the god who does not openly revoke the verdict but there slips around it, preserving life without permission. I think about how often civilizations keep the name of a benefactor while relocating his power, preserving the image while domesticating the implication. That may be what troubles me most. Not that Enki vanished. He did not. He remained in texts, in incantations, in museum cases, in the fatherhood of Marduk, in the deep grammar of Mesopotamian memory. What changed was his position. He becomes indispensable and secondary at the same time, too old to deny, too inconvenient to centre. A god remembered everywhere and allowed to rule nowhere obvious. And when I look at that seal now, I do not see a forgotten mythological extra. I see a record in stone, out of an idea ancient people preserved with surprising honesty, that one of the highest powers in their universe did not agree with what the higher order wanted done to us. A god can survive in stone for 4,000 years and still look less erased than the reason we stopped listening.